Hello and welcome. I'm Brian Berletic, and joining me today is a very special guest, Daniel Dumbrill. I think a lot of people who follow my work know who he is, and in the comment sections, a lot of people have said, when are you going to have a discussion with Daniel Dumbrill? So now we're having a discussion with Daniel Dumbrill, and I have just done a discussion on his channel, and I'll put the link in the video description below. So hello, Daniel. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm still here in my 21-day quarantine. Happy to use it up any way possible. I mean, I would have been happy to join you for a conversation anyways, but yeah, doing well. Just came back from Hong Kong, so I'll be here for a bit.
Okay, so today we're just gonna kind of do what I did over on your channel. We're just gonna kind of talk to you about your background, how you got into talking about some of these heavy issues surrounding geopolitics, and kind of an advocate of looking at China for real and looking through the propaganda and what China is like for real. And you're drawing on your experience because you live in China. So maybe just start out with what is your background? What were you doing before you went to China? What made you go to China?
Yeah, so I was just doing business. I was doing import and export. I also opened up a brew pub here in China. Just kind of doing my own thing. I worked for a big corporation, a telecommunications company in Canada for a while. And then, after I had quit that, I had just been working for myself ever since then. It has absolutely nothing to do with geopolitics or commenting on this kind of stuff or vlogging or news. That wasn't just like you. That wasn't my main thing. So that's kind of my background, basically. I mean, I was born in England, but I was raised in Canada. Moved over there when I was 5. Mixed family, so multiple perspectives in the family. My dad is British, my mom is from South America, from Guyana. Some of the things that played out in Guyana kind of influenced the way I look at things as well, in terms of geopolitics, but not until later in life when I was kind of prompted by these what happened in Hong Kong. But that's kind of my backstory. It's pretty basic, nothing special.
And what made you decide to, hey, I'm going to go to China? And now how long have you been in China, and what got you there in the first place?
I've been here for 13 years, and I just, I could have continued running my business from Canada, but I came over to Hong Kong for a trade show. Then I popped over to Shenzhen and I saw it, and I just thought it was a really exciting place with a lot of stuff going on. And so I made an excuse to kind of just say, okay, I'm going to run my business from here, even though I could have continued running it from Canada. I was just kind of bored in Canada. It's just a whole different pace of life, a little bit more slow paced. And this is coming from, I mean, Toronto is probably one of the more active places in Canada compared to everyone else. But even then, I was just looking for something more, some new experiences. I grew up in a small town north of Toronto, really kind of small town mindset, lots of interesting friends, not very multicultural. A lot of my friends, I would say, a big range of people in that kind of an area. You had some affluent people, but also some of my friends lived in trailer parks as well. So it was kind of just a really small town on the outskirts of Toronto. And so perhaps somewhere inside me, I just wanted to get as far away from that as possible, experience something as far away as that as possible. And I think I chose the right city, because Shenzhen is like, it's been consistently one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And the pace that things have happened here, it absolutely blows you away, particularly Shenzhen compared to other places in China, because other places in China like Shanghai and Beijing, they're established cities, they're old cities, where Shenzhen is a new city. It was a blank canvas and they were building it into whatever they wanted. And then the other thing too is it was a particularly welcoming place too, compared to other places in China. Everywhere in China is welcoming to foreigners, but Shenzhen was just that much more. Shenzhen's motto here is, once you come to Shenzhen, you become a Shenzhen person. Because most people here, there are very few local people here. Most people here are from somewhere else in China. And in that sense, we're all kind of on an equal level here. We were all not born in Shenzhen, but now we all call Shenzhen our home. So you really feel like you're a part of the community, even if you're not actually Chinese. Now, I've lived here the entire time, 13 years. So, but I've traveled to a lot of other places. That's the feeling I get in terms of why Shenzhen is different and why I just fell in love with the city.
Yeah, that actually, where you came from in Canada, it kind of sounds like where my family ended up moving in central Pennsylvania. And it really is. It's like people are just passing the time and nothing's going on. When you go to Asia in general, there's just this sense that everything is on the move. There's constant progress. There's constant things to look forward to, positive things. And that kind of sounds like what you found when you arrived in China. Now, did you have any preconceptions about China before you went that were kind of challenged, or like a bubble that was popped when you arrived there, or did you have a pretty open mind?
I would say I had a pretty open mind. I would say I had a pretty open mind, but I believed most of the propaganda about China. But I was just kind of building up the experiences myself. Even the first few years I was here, I even still believed the propaganda that I was listening to, even though I was, that's how deep seated some of this propaganda gets in your mind. Like, you're seeing it with your own eyes. You're not seeing anything that the mainstream media is talking about overseas, yet you still believe it. So it took me a while to break out from that. But these weren't things that I really thought about too much when I first arrived here. I was just kind of living my life, meeting people, enjoying talking to people, learning about the country and stuff like that. But I wasn't really necessarily measuring it up against, okay, what was I expecting and what did I actually see? Because I did keep a pretty open mind. I do remember, I'm trying to remember back, like the way I thought about China before. And there was a period of time where I actually started, I wanted to start vlogging, because there were some things that were showing up on mainstream media that I was just like, this doesn't really make sense. And it was about blaming Chinese companies for certain things, but actually the middlemen and the people who were putting pressures on these factories to use certain materials or get the cost down to a certain amount completely were absolved from any responsibility from defective products that came in or products that came in with toxic, paints and stuff like that. And I just thought, this is really odd. And I looked back at that channel. I never ended up posting the video. But I looked back at that. That must have been in like 2006 or something like that. And I forgot even what I said. So I looked back at it. It's on private on that old YouTube channel. And I was saying, you know what, guys, this doesn't really make sense. So I think even though I say I probably believed most of the propaganda, I was open-minded enough to just not really let that affect my opinion of China too much.
And maybe kind of prepare the ground to have your eyes opened about what was going on. Yeah, I mean, we'll get into that later, because you say actually the crisis in Hong Kong spanned quite a few years. Was it the most recent round of protests, or was it back in, I think, 2014, something like that? When was it?
You're talking about the Occupy Central. Actually, you know what? During the Occupy Central, I kind of empathized with the protesters. I was kind of, I would say, I was kind of on their side. Based on my limited digging into the situation and looking at the situation on the surface, I kind of empathized with them, and that didn't bother me at all. It was mostly peaceful. And that was actually the case for a lot of Hong Kongers as well. Hong Kongers were like, you know what, back then it was fine. I could empathize with them, whatever. They're demonstrating. These are some of the freedoms we have in Hong Kong. But as soon as the new set of protests happened, that's when people were like, no, this is not right. Like, you're saying that you are afraid of surveillance, but then you're stopping mainlanders in the streets and demanding they open their phone, and you're searching their phone. You're saying that you want political freedoms, but you're burning down the offices of your political opponents and stabbing one of the other political opponents, the pro-establishment component politicians, in the chest. Torching businesses that have not even owners, but the owners have relatives who said something negative about the protesters, like Annie Wu. When they went after her canteens, well, not her canteens, her family's canteens and stuff like that, started absolutely destroying them. it was like, okay, this is messed up. And there was a huge xenophobic element as well. That was what was interesting to me too, because when in Guyana, just as they were approaching independence, there was a guy who was elected named Chetty Jagan, and he was a little bit kind of Marxist-Leninist leaning, and the U.S. didn't want another kind of a Cuba situation in the region. So they went in and they created race riots between the population of African descent and Indian descent, and it just went into chaos. It was absolute disaster. And then the British went in and they used it as an excuse to suspend parliament. When the dust settled, there was somebody else in who wasn't that friendly to, the Soviet and the ideas of Marxism. And so when I was always hearing about that and hearing stories from my grandmother and stuff like that, I was just really curious about how would something like that actually play out? Like, how would they do something like this? And just to make sure I clarify to everybody, this isn't a conspiracy theory. Those documents, it's old enough where those documents are already declassified from MI5 and the CIA. They're available on, I think they're even on the State Department website. But what I saw playing out in Hong Kong, I was like, hold on a second. You know what? I feel like there's some similarities going on here, because you had Jimmy Lai, this, media tycoon, who in his publications were calling mainlanders locusts and all of this stuff, like bringing this ethnic tension up. And this is a guy who's regularly in Washington, D.C. You see him hanging out with John Bolton and all these people. And he's like the architect behind this kind of, well, at least he's helping push it along. Because here's the thing, in a lot of societies, there are underlying issues. And if an outside force is coming in, they just basically leech onto that and they prop it up. And I felt like that's what I saw unfolding in Hong Kong. I probably went a little bit too far off from the question you asked me, but
that's okay, because we're gonna. I wanted to get into when you actually started noticing that there was a foreign hand interfering in Hong Kong and ultimately in China's internal political affairs. I kind of want to go back a little bit and just say, ask you one last question about when you first got to China, and then over the years. I mean, for a lot of people, they experience a little bit of a culture shock and then kind of a honeymoon experience where everything is great. Some people, depending, person to person. And then, over time, you start to get a more realistic understanding of the country, the people, and sometimes it even kind of changes you. I mean, for me personally, Thai people have a very middle ground approach to everything. They're very calm and moderate about everything, and that has really rubbed off on me, and very tolerant about a lot of things, even things you might think you shouldn't be. But when you see them put it into practice, it really has changed me over the years. And I was wondering if you underwent a similar experience being in China.
Yeah, I'd say that. There are different mannerisms. There's different things that people would or wouldn't get angry about, and you do kind of adapt to the local ways of life, for sure. Absolutely. Even driving mannerisms, and driving is kind of crazy here compared to the West. If you look at it on the surface. So when I go back now I feel like I'm the outsider in my own country. It's kind of like reverse culture shock. So absolutely, I've adapted to here. I think when you say honeymoon phase, one important thing about understanding the progression of people in China as well, because there's a lot of people, it seems like 3 to 5 years is kind of the time period that a lot of people can do. And then after that, it's like, that's it, I've had enough. And they just can't adapt. But there's another dynamic in China that foreigners were kind of special in China before, like they weren't as common, and they're still treated really, really well in China, but they don't get as much privilege as they used to. And I like that. I remember pretty much from the beginning, all of my closest friends here are Chinese. And, I remember hanging out. One of my friends is a restaurant owner. I would always eat food with their staff. Like I would know their chef would come over to my house sometimes, not to cook, just as friends, like hanging out, having a drink or something like that. But when I was at their restaurant, or they had friends, they would always treat me like really special. Like they'd give me lots of extra attention. And I actually didn't like that. I just wanted to be one of the crowd. And it's becoming more and more like that. So I appreciate that. But for other people, and you can imagine who I'm talking about, some of these other people, as they lose that privilege, it makes them really kind of not very happy about it. And they just fall out of love with China because, they used to be a superstar and now all of a sudden they're treated like an ordinary person. Because we mentioned somebody yesterday, I don't want to talk about them today, but we mentioned someone yesterday. That is the kind of the dynamic that some of these guys go through.
Well, we don't have to talk about those people specifically, but I actually did want to kind of get into the expat community there in
Yeah.
China, because I think there's across Asia, you will find the exact same thing. Here in Thailand, there's a lot of Westerners that come here. Um, they feel like they're just going to come here and walk around like a viceroy, and everyone is just going to attend to them and bow down to them. And there's certain places, like a very tiny, like just a street or two in the entire city, that cater to tourists, where they feel, they're special. And then as soon as they walk out of that street, they get bored of that and they try to go elsewhere. And then they realize, no, this is a real country with real people. They're not impressed with you. They do things their way. They've been doing it for a long time, longer than some Western countries have even existed. And they're not interested in your ideas or what you think they should do. And they do, and it's amazing because they'll stay here for years and years, and they will just become extremely bitter, and just a whole sewer pipe full of people like this. And they're in forums, they're in the comment sections of English language newspapers. There's just a whole gaggle of them. They'll lobby, they'll all get together and because they got nothing else better to do oftentimes. And I'm just wondering if there's a similar situation like that, because you're an expat that has adapted very well to life in China. Others have not. So maybe tell us a little bit about how it works in China.
No, absolutely. There's that dynamic also. And by the way, you're cutting out a little bit. If I start cutting out, just let me know, and I can change my connection here. But there definitely is that dynamic with people here too, where they feel like they should have some sort of privilege just because they're foreigners here. It's a complete opposite. I mean, when immigrants go to Western countries, they're learning to accept a position below everybody else. But here, people come here and they have this weird thing that happens where they think they're supposed to be treated special. And you definitely see that all around. I think even a couple of years ago, I called one of them out. I just saw somebody just acting like a complete idiot. And I'm like, who are you to think you can do this to people? And it's annoying. You don't see it as much because it's not tolerated as much also, but you definitely have that dynamic. There are other expats, there are many other expats here who are not like that. They completely respect the local culture, and they're just embarrassed by people like that because they kind of, unfortunately, the way that people's minds work, they kind of give us all a bad name, and even though it shouldn't work that way. But yeah, no, definitely have a very similar kind of experience.
Yeah, and I think it's because Western people have the idea put into their head that their ideas, their way of doing things is the best, because that's how their governments talk. And I guess that's going to kind of play into when we start getting into geopolitics. But one more thing I wanted to kind of ask about, when you went to China and you were there for a while and you had these misconceptions, you bought into a lot of the myths we all have. And I'm just wondering, when did you start waking up? Like, just for example, Tiananmen 1989, this is a huge myth surrounding the actual events that happened there. And this is because of Western propaganda. Something like that. When did you start waking up to things like that, and how did that happen?
I would say, like, when I really started looking at it in a meaningful way was like really the Hong Kong protests is what really pushed me to say, no, I got to really take a deeper look at this. And I mean, some of my friends who I knew were on the ground in '89. And I talked to them about it too. And what the Hong Kong protests did was really interesting for everybody, because even people who were on the ground in '89, because there were a lot of things that the government did wrong during it, but of course we don't understand the full story. Most of us in the West don't understand the full story. But after what happened in Hong Kong, and after they saw what was happening, even the people who were students in those protests started looking at '89 differently. And they started empathizing with what the government had to deal with more than. And it's a bizarre thing. I mean, it's not up for me to judge them. I mean, still, you look at, there were people who died, but that was what pushed me to say, okay, let's take a deeper look at this. And when you say, okay, you take an honest look and you really ask, what would have happened in the post George Floyd protests if 200 soldiers and young police officers were burnt and killed and lynched and hanged in the street, just like they were in Tiananmen Square. Even the guy who took the photo of the tank man, the guy standing in front of the tank, I mean, he was smashed in the face by the protesters, you know, and said he saw firsthand, you know, soldiers being pulled out of their vehicles and killed. Well, he says, I don't think that guy made it. Basically, that's what he said in one of his interviews on, I think it was CBS or something like that. But to answer your question, absolutely, the Hong Kong protests is what put it in high gear for me. What I used to get a kick out of before that was talking to my wife's family, who are very patriotic, and showing them documentaries, anti-China documentaries, and seeing how they react to it. Like, you know, my wife's brother, unfortunately, he had passed away from brain cancer a few years ago. You know, very patriotic guy, also worked for the government. And when he came over, I would show him like Ai Weiwei documentaries. I would show him all this kind of stuff, and he'd be like, wow, you know, there's definitely some issues, but he'd still be really patriotic. He'd still be like, he'd try to explain to me like a greater context, but I wasn't really ready to listen to it then. You know, I watched To Live, a documentary about kind of land reform or cultural revolution era. And I watched it with my wife's family. I put it up on the screen on the projector, and my father-in-law couldn't finish the movie because he said it was too real. It brought back too many bad memories, and he left the room. But after it was all said and done, all these people were still really patriotic and really still loved their country and loved their government. You know, when you see that study from Harvard University saying 92%, 93% of people support their government, you can believe it if you really understand the Chinese people. It really is that high. And so my way of processing back then was, man, these people are really brainwashed. You know, that was my way of processing it. But then slowly I got to the point, I'm like, shit, hang on a second. Maybe it's me who's brainwashed. And so I had some of these inklings. That was an epiphany I had before the Hong Kong protests. So, you know, there was a transition happening, but the Hong Kong protests is what really put it into high gear.
I mean, when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, were you just weren't paying attention to politics, or?
We all knew it was bad. You know, it was like, I wasn't really into politics then, but it was like, what the heck is going on? You know, even what was going on in Afghanistan. You know, when I was listening to Ron Paul talking about some reflective questions about why these people want to attack the U.S., I knew something was wrong. But I think, I don't know what it was. I don't know why. It was just like, oh, whatever, because maybe it's just a feeling of, well, what can you really do about it? What can you do about it? This is just the way things work. I've seen people protest. I've seen people do these things. It doesn't do anything. They're still going to keep doing this. I didn't think to do what I'm doing now, to create a channel and try to get this message out a lot more. But I think I needed to wait anyways. I needed to see more, and I especially needed to see what happened in Hong Kong and how that unfolded to really give me all of the perspective and the drive that I needed to say, okay, no, now I want to try to say something about this. So I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say if it's that I wasn't really paying enough attention with what was going on in Iraq, or I just didn't care enough. And when I say I didn't care enough, people got to understand that when you don't actually look under the covers, a lot of the atrocious images of what's going on are hidden from you. You don't get to see that stuff. I mean, if mainstream media was showing us the truth more often, I think I would have cared. I think more people would care. But we get kind of, as much as they, you know, talk about American war crimes and stuff like that, the really dirty stuff is covered up. They don't show you that stuff. So I'd probably say it's just I didn't care enough because I wasn't informed enough to know that I really should care more.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, I was already kind of awake to everything, but I think it was still good for me to wait a while before I started writing and producing content, because there were still a lot of things that I didn't understand. So there was this important period that I went through where I was just doing a lot of studying before I was saying anything about it. And so, yeah, I guess like let's get more into Hong Kong. I mean, when that was all happening, because I remember Occupy Central, and I remember trying to tell everyone this was fake. It was backed by the U.S. Yeah, there were probably people in the streets who thought they were out there for good reasons, but it's just like a soldier who thinks he's fighting for freedom and democracy in Iraq. That's what he thinks, but that's not what he's really doing. It only actually matters what you're actually there for. And Joshua Wong traveling to Washington and the NED backing all the opposition leaders through different fronts that they were running in Hong Kong, that was already happening in Occupy Central. So what was it? I guess you kind of touched on it already, the violence. The violence and the hypocrisy, which is a feature of pretty much every US-backed color revolution. So you're saying this is what actually started waking you up. Were you actually ever in Hong Kong when this was going on? Or were you just kind of, go ahead.
I mean, I have a cross-border car, so it's a dual license plate car. I'm in Hong Kong all the time. So I was going to Hong Kong during that time period. I didn't ever go to any of the protests, but I was talking to a lot of my friends there. And it was a lot of my friends in, like Yanlong, where that big attack happened in the train station when the white shirts kind of attacked the protesters. That was during the early stages when I knew there was something wrong with the protesters. I thought what the guys in the white shirts did was totally wrong. I didn't think that should have happened. But what I found surprising was like family of my friends or their neighbors and stuff like that in Yanlong. I thought they would have been, like I was saying, because there was supposed to be a follow-up event, and the white shirts apparently were going to go again. They're apparently triad-connected people. And so I told them, I'm like, oh, be careful. Don't go there. The white shirts are coming again. And they were like, oh, yeah, we're going with, we support the white shirts. We're going with them. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? And I still don't think that was right. But for people to get that fed up where they were like cheering on people who were fighting back against the protesters, that was also kind of a second layer where I was like, I got to dig deeper into this. I got to figure out what's going on. And there were a lot of people in other districts that just were afraid to speak up against the protesters. I mean, there's plenty of videos out there of what happens when you even try to clean their roadblocks. There was an old lady clearing the roadblocks out, and they were shining these high-powered green lasers into her eyes. And she started yelling at them, said, do what you want. This is all you can do. This is all you're good at. If you want to shine lasers in my eyes, shine lasers in my eyes. There was another guy who had who cleaned out the street at night, and they came with this iron drain cover and smacked him right across the side of the head. Blood started pouring out, and he was completely dazed and fell down to the ground. Like, no, everybody was afraid of these protesters. And so with me living in Xinjiang, I felt if I was still living in Hong Kong, because I lived in Hong Kong for a couple of years, if I was still living in Hong Kong, I have a family, I have kids during that time, I would have not spoken up. And there were a lot of people who wanted to speak up, and for the same reason, they didn't speak up. So as things were evolving, I started speaking from the safety of Shenzhen. I knew I would be able to do that fine. And some of the protesters still, they were digging up pictures of my kids and posting it saying, oh, I hope your kids are okay and stuff like that. And it's like, see, this is exactly why I would not have said anything if I was in Hong Kong. It was like I think he was a Russian guy or something like that who was joining the protests or something like that. He was, or someone from Ukraine or something like that. So that was, I've completely forgotten what your original question is, but I've gone off on a tangent about all of the different things that really pushed me to say something. And after I started putting that stuff out, I had people who hadn't contacted me in years, who were my kids' classmates in Hong Kong, their parents reaching out to me, thanking me for saying something, saying, or thank you so much. I saw your video going viral on Facebook. I'm glad you said something because we can't say anything. We can't say anything here, and our position is too dangerous.
Exactly. And this is, I just find it interesting how this is the exact same pattern in every single US-backed opposition movement, riot, color revolution, whatever you want to call it. They're talking about fighting for democracy. They usually represent a minority. And then what are they doing? They're shutting down any conversation, any discussion. There's no debate. They're using violence. Just like you said before, they're against surveillance, but then they're doing the exact same thing. They also engage in censorship. They also, if you speak up and they know where you're running your business. They try to destroy your business. What kind of country would that be if there was a government in power that acted like that? It would be exactly what they claim the Chinese government is, but in reality, not in fiction, as they accuse the Chinese government of.
It's funny you should say that. It's funny you should say that. You know what? When I had some Hong Kong, there was a Hong Kong artist who came over, who I know, a friend, and she was doing a pop-up show here in Shenzhen. And as soon as she crossed the border and came over, she said to the mainland, she said, "Oh, finally, I can speak freely." Like, this was the irony of, Hong Kong, which has completely, free speech, everything like that. And she had to wait till she came to the mainland to be able to say what she wanted. And what's also important to note, it's not that you could only say things against the protesters in China. I was at RV events when there were people who supported the protesters, and they'd get in arguments with other people and they discuss it, they debate it. But the other people, they're not going and beating the crap out of them like they were in Hong Kong. They're still friends the next day. They're not lighting them on fire like they lit that guy on fire and the construction worker in the MTR station. Like, you could actually speak about it from both sides, and that was the ultimate irony, that you had to come to the mainland to speak freely if you wanted to. I had to be located in the mainland to be able to express the opinion that I had.
That is an irony, and something else I want to kind of point out and maybe get your thoughts on is there was this level of violence. And how the Western media, not only did they downplay it or completely ignore it, but they also kind of used it to their advantage, because just as you said, people were not speaking up. So there was this silent majority that was in fear. They would not speak up. And the Western media used their silence as evidence that, oh, everyone is supporting the mobs. I don't see anyone coming out opposing them. And it was because there was an atmosphere of fear and terror. And this is why people weren't speaking up. And they've kind of done the same thing here in Thailand, because just like you said yesterday, it's like they dropped off a Hong Kong style mob care package. They're all dressed the same. They're acting the same. They're targeting businesses and individuals in the same way. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit, and maybe explain if this was a contributing factor to get you to kind of more consistently come out doing videos and exposing this. How did the Western media's, kind of sinister role in all of this?
I mean, the whole environment, protects these mainstream narratives. I mean, it wasn't only a matter of in Hong Kong, you're not allowed to speak out against the protesters or there's consequences. Even in the West, if you're in an academic role in America or in Canada or in the UK and you speak out against the Hong Kong protesters, you see what happens. There were people, I knew people who wanted to speak up, but they said no. And there were these, free Hong Kong groups going around to the different universities and stuff like that, petitioning people to sign this, put their name on this thing to end the CCP or whatever it was. And the most people could do is just say, okay, no, I don't know enough about the situation. I'm not going to sign it. But heaven forbid they actually spoke up and said, no, actually, I don't agree with you guys. I mean, you would be completely roasted. And then the way that the mainstream media comes into play, which is also the way that they preserve these narratives about Xinjiang, is when they find people to support the narrative, who support the narrative. And I spoke about this yesterday with you. They will ask them meaningful questions. They'll engage them with their ideas. They'll talk to them as an equal. When and if they engage with somebody who doesn't agree with the mainstream narrative, on the off occasions that they do, it turns into an interrogation. It turns into, oh, this guy must be doing it for this reason. This guy owns a business in the mainland. That must be why he's doing it. Or, asking superficial questions like, how does it feel to be a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party? The whole system is designed around creating these narratives and making it look artificially, making an artificial consensus when really there isn't a consensus. The truth is a lot of people in Hong Kong were propagandized into believing what they're believing. It starts with their education also. If you look at their liberal arts education, the kinds of material they were putting in to the education system, it's really not surprising that they grew up with this weird sense of reality and history that their time under the British was the good times under the colonial era, and they're dreaming of democracy and freedom again. Yet there was never ever a single election for their governor. The democratic freedoms they started getting awarded was just towards the end, as a kind of a ticking time bomb for China, that's when they started introducing little bits and pieces of freedom. But I mean, if you look at how the Hong Kong police, the Hong Kong British run police handled the protests in '67 versus how they handled it recently, I mean, it's like night and day. I mean, they were like, if they tried to do what they did these last few years while the British were still in power, they'd have a pretty good understanding of no. There wasn't really actually freedoms back then. But there's this completely skewed idea of reality in Hong Kong for some of these people. But getting back to my main point, so it's not surprising that a lot of people are convinced by this. But a lot of people, when the last district elections, the district councillor elections, the pro-democracy parties won a lot of seats. It was like over 80% or something like that. So people say that, well, that shows that, you know, most people want to separate from China. Well, actually, not many people want to separate from China in Hong Kong. And because of the way that the elections work, it was only about 57% of the people who voted for pro-democracy parties, and it would be for various reasons. So that doesn't also necessarily mean that they want to, you know, separate or something like that. But that really goes to show how tricky it is in a society when it's that divided. It's almost 50-50, and it's just this battle between different sides. And as, you know, one of the famous quotes is, you know, democracy sometimes is like, you know, two wolves and a lamb deciding what's for dinner. And that was kind of the situation you had in Hong Kong.
And we were kind of talking about this yesterday, too, about the Western concept of democracy, how in the West it is a system of control to give people the illusion that they have some sort of control over their own destiny, when in reality it's a system of control so that they don't realize they have no control. And it's interesting how you said, as the British were getting ready to leave Hong Kong, hand it back over to China, they were introducing, you know, these superficiality, you know, it was democracy on a very superficial level, but it was also kind of them extending that system of control over Hong Kong so that when they left, they would still have the little wires were still going back to their hands and they could still manipulate things. And I think that's an important thing to kind of talk about consensus. If you have control over the media, you could get people to believe just about anything. And I think this has been proven over and over again all throughout history. And so when you're talking about consensus, Hong Kong people want to vote for, you know, pro-democracy parties, or even if they all wanted independence, does that really, is that a decision that they arrived at on their own, or is that through propaganda funded and influenced by foreign interests? And then if that's the case, is that really democracy, or is that foreign interference? And what if Hong Kong got their independence? What would that do to Hong Kong to be hostile with the mainland? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is that kind of a similar way you think, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky situation. You know, as I mentioned to you before, I'm reading this book, the you know, Democracy for Realists, to figure out what it is that makes the positives and negatives about democracy. And people are irrational. You know, they make irrational decisions, and it shows in the way that politics plays it out as well. Like a president knows that almost nothing they do in the first 1 or 2 years of the presidency matters. You know, the last year before an election, that's when it really matters. And you start making these. You know, for example, they make an example in the book where, you know, the first few years of a presidency, they focus on increasing the GDP. But then the last year, they focus on increasing the income, where the income outpaces the growth of GDP. You know, they should be growing together slowly, but they have to do that in order to get enough approval to continue on to the next term. So there's all these kinds of, it talks about the irrational behaviors of voters and stuff like that, but it's a tricky thing. I still haven't figured it out. I don't know what to say about that when a group of people have been propagandized into believing a certain thing, and then their government has to listen to those demands, even though it was artificially introduced. And I think that's where the context for controlling, you know, having some controls on the internet in China comes in also, is because they know if they open it up, there are constant psychological warfare operations against China. through the USAGM, Voice of America, and stuff like that. And it's very, very effective. You can convince people to do very irrational things, even in Tibet. When, the Dalai Lama's own brother in his book says that one of his biggest regrets in retrospect was working with the CIA, because if the CIA got what they wanted in Tibet, it would have turned into another Libya, Syria, Iraq. They were not out for their best interests. So you imagine, while these kinds of people were in China, if they were still in control and they said, yes, we're going to completely align with the CIA, I mean, the entire population would have been in a pretty messed up situation right now. So I don't really know. I don't really know what the answer is to that. But if when people blame societies like China for not opening up more, while simultaneously trying to run psychological warfare campaigns on China in the 60s, training rebels in Colorado in Camp Hale, and then sending them back to Tibet to create an uprising, clandestine operations in Fujian province in regards to Taiwan. Like, how can you keep saying, why are you so closed, while you've got all these guns pointed at China in the meantime? Like, China has always been under a constant attack. And when you look back at, like, the world wars, when World War II, during those periods of time when Western countries were in a time of war, democratic freedoms were also suspended and tailored back during those periods of time. Well, you imagine that it's been an ongoing, constant war against China. You can see millions and millions of dollars being funded into anti-China, propaganda campaigns. So in regards to Hong Kong, if an outside force could come in and convince everybody saying, yes, you need to get independence, it's a complicated situation. But of course, China needs to consider, well, what would that mean for the national security of all of China as well? Because that's just going to become basically another client state of, the neo-colonial American empire. And this is going to be another threat on their doorstep. These are all considerations that need to be thought out. But I'm not going to pretend like I know what the answer is for all of these things.
Yeah, and what I always say is it's up to China to decide this. And the British had no justification or reason to be in Hong Kong in the first place. They seized it by force. They got China to agree to all of these conditions before the handover. I mean, it's like you got someone that broke into your house and they're making all of these conditions about I'll leave, but you have to agree to all of these things. It's a criminal that's in your house in the first place. You don't owe them anything. So even if under duress you have to agree to these things to get them out, once they're out, call the police. And in China's case, they don't need to call the police because they're a strong country now. They don't have to listen to the UK anymore. So what you were talking about suspending, in the West, suspending democracy during a time of war, and how the West just portrays all of these countries, not just China, but every country that it's targeting and trying to undermine, destabilize, divide, and destroy. And in some cases, we've seen the final result. Libya, for example, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. When they're successful in doing this, the country is completely obliterated or nearly obliterated. And this is what people don't understand. It's not that these countries are evil dictatorships for the sake of being a dictatorship. They're doing it because they are under attack. They're trying to defend themselves. And this kind of springboards into our next topic, Xinjiang. Now, when I started watching your work, I was watching your videos about Xinjiang, and you like really lay it out very clearly. I think you've helped persuade a lot of people. You've really helped educate people who knew there was something wrong going on, but you filled in all of the blanks, things that they didn't quite understand. So I'm kind of interested in when did this grab your attention? How did you start unraveling all of this? And then you went to Xinjiang, and then there was this village. One of my favorite episodes that you did was this village that they built for these people that were living up in the mountains. It was a very practical solution, and they built this. The Chinese government built this whole village for them to come down. If they didn't want to, they didn't have to, but they signed it over to their name and they could rent it. So maybe you could just go into all of that wherever you want to get started.
Yeah. So it was after Hong Kong was kind of wrapped up, and the ridiculousness of it, the finishing up on the interference thing, seeing, am I still coming through okay on your side?
Yes.
For the connection?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Yes.
Seeing the senators like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz fly over to Hong Kong and cheer on the protesters and fly back, and trying to imagine if during the Capitol Hill riots the same thing happened in reverse, if Chinese Communist Party officials flew from Beijing over to Washington, D.C. to say, go freedom fighters, what would have happened? What would have been the reaction? And I just thought, this is unbelievable that people can't see through this. So when America's focus then changed to Xinjiang, I said, I'm following. I'm not just, and I think this is the problem, right? America targets one place. The people who are affected by that place or know something specifically about that place are fighting back. But then America moves on to the next target. No, I'm following them. Their money is going that direction. I mean, their money's been going in that direction for a long time, but it really started ramping up. I said, okay, let me look into this. I know people in Xinjiang, both ethnic minorities and Han Chinese. This was never a topic that I ever really spoke about beforehand. And so I started reaching out to them a little bit more. I actually had the staff at my brew pub had to remind me, we actually had a Uyghur staff before too. We had a girl that was working for us who came to Shenzhen by herself. We had many different ethnic minorities working with us. Izhou people from Lijiang and Yunnan, and Mongol, and apparently Uyghur as well. And so it was like, okay, something's not adding up here also. So I followed the money over to that direction, and just what unravels is really unbelievable, especially if you already bring in the context of what has happened before. When you understand, for example, that America is starting to sanction Xinjiang, or trying to find ways to sanction it, and you already know that sanctions are designed to make ordinary people on the ground suffer so that they rise up against their government, and you build that into context you add into the fact that America has delisted ETIM as a terrorist organization, and you add into the fact that, the World Bank and all these different groups have done research to show that unemployment creates an environment ideal for extremism. And then you put into context that America regularly uses terrorism to accomplish their geopolitical goals, all the way back from, funding the Mujahideen, to moderate rebels in Syria, to John Kerry admitting that he was turning a blind eye to ISIS because they were going to advance against Assad. And you realize that the people here in China, what they really want to happen is they really want a resurgence of this of this terrorism. And when they're sanctioning these people, when they're sanctioning the Uyghur people, over cotton products, and that people living in the south of Xinjiang, Uyghur people have their own plots of land. They grow their own cotton. This is how they survive. How it's going to affect them. You're like, this is evil, it's wrong, and I got to speak up about it as well. So those are some of the different kind of aspects that went into it. So it looks like from the outside, it's just this general fighting back against anti-China propaganda. No matter what you say bad about China, I'm going to fight against it. But it's not really that. It's just that happened to be the natural progression. And in some of my videos, as you've probably seen before, I'll say that there are places where the Chinese government gets it wrong. And that I'm not comfortable with, but it's certainly not what's being portrayed in the West. And it's annoying too, because I also think back to the time when I was younger and believing all of the mainstream media narratives, and how fooled I was. And I'm seeing all of the same stuff happen again. And I'm like, people should be annoyed that they're being lied to like this. And I want to tell them they're being lied to. I want to expose this. So that's how it's kind of a little bit of a messy description of different ways that I started digging into this.
Hold on a second. Let me see if I can get this part up here. So let's back up a little bit. Xinjiang is in Western China. It borders Afghanistan, where the U.S. has been occupying for 20 years. There was serious terrorism in Xinjiang. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people getting killed, not just Han Chinese, but other Uyghurs were being killed.
Oh, yeah.
The violence spread all across China. There was violence outside of China in 2015. There was a bombing here in Bangkok, killed 20 people. That was violent Uyghur separatists, and thousands of them have traveled to Syria to go fight in America's proxy war against the government there. And so this has been going on for a long time, and the U.S. has been behind it the entire time. This isn't something that they just, hey, look at this, let's use this. No, they were driving this, and I've shown. And I don't know if you've seen this, but how Saudi Arabia played a role in radicalizing certain segments of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. Let me see if I can, let's share the screen here. I just want to show people how far back this goes. This is the Office of the Historian. It's the State Department's official website. It's a .gov website. And they're talking about how the war in Vietnam only makes sense if it's in support of a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. And they talk about how China, looms as a major power threatening to undercut our importance and effectiveness in the world, and more remotely, but more menacingly, to organize all of Asia against us. This sounds like it could have been written yesterday. And
right.
They show the fronts that they're going to do this along, the Japan-Korea front, the India-Pakistan front, and Southeast Asia. And again, this is exactly what's playing out. So the destabilization of Xinjiang, the sponsorship of terrorism there, this is all part of this, what the U.S. itself in its own documents admits. So what got you to actually go to Xinjiang? Because that's a little bit out of the way. It's pretty far out there. It's quite remote.
I mean, I just had to go see it for myself. I had to go, I know people from Xinjiang. There's plenty of them that live in Shenzhen, but I just wanted to go see it for myself and see what was going on. But yeah, I mean, it's really important to the summary that you were putting out there, that this is something that's been a long time in the making. China's been under constant attack. And you know what, the weaponization of compassion also, they're trying all these different angles to attack China, but the weaponization of compassion, saying, okay, there's a genocide going on. This is something we really need to care about. I mean, you gotta first understand that the US will ignore human rights abuses from countries that are allies or serve some sort of a geopolitical interest, but also, even more important, they will manufacture lies or threats against countries in order to accomplish a not yet realized geopolitical goal. So as soon as even $1 of funding from the U.S. is going towards a specific narrative, I mean, that should get your spidey senses going, and that's what's happening here. And I think because I think you started in a good place where we start with the summary. You got to understand that we're hearing that China is genociding the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in a population that has continually increased, which is not experiencing a mass exodus or refugee crisis, and who is represented by a handful of voices that's being carted around in U.S. Government panels like it's Naira 2.0. When they had the 14-year-old Kuwaiti girl saying she saw babies being thrown from incubators. And so the people that are being carted around also are not people who left China illegally. They left legally on their government-issued passports through exit immigrations, after they escaped the concentration camps, apparently. The few who do leave Xinjiang illegally cross through Southeast Asia, and they end up in Turkey and are ferried across to Syria to fight alongside Al-Qaeda, and whose children are being trained in ISIS-built training camps. And we spoke about this a little bit yesterday. Western governments are not intercepting these folks and giving them a home in the West before they end up in Syria, because they know that China's claims are about specific radicalized groups is absolutely true. And they don't want another kind of a Libya situation on their hands where they, align with Salafist jihadists who are fighting against a common enemy, in this case, Assad. Because afterwards they learned that they then started performing jihad at home after their job was finished. So this is, it's a narrative that just absolutely doesn't make sense. And I really just had to go and see it for myself. I even took some coordinates with me. I reached out to some anti-China voices. I would say that one of them was probably one of the top 5 or top 10 most prolific anti-China voices in the world. I don't want to mention who it is because I said our conversations will be private. But I asked them too. I said, you know what? You tell me, if you were going to Xinjiang, what would you be looking for? What questions would you be asking? And I wanted to go and do kind of an investigation myself. So one of the things he said, for example, was go to a bookstore. You'll find that there's no more children's Uyghur books. They're completely banned. And I did. I went to a bookstore. I chose a random one. I went into it. Like all of the Uyghur books were on the first floor. They had Henry Kissinger's book translated into Uyghur script also. Like, you know, how extreme is that? If you wanted English or Chinese, simplified Chinese books, you had to go up to the second floor in the back corner. And it was kind of comical. You started kind of feeling like an idiot. I remember when I went into the bookstore, first of all, I started filming to send a video to this guy, and the staff kind of yelled at me. First of all, they were like, hey, you're not supposed to film in here. And I was like, is this some kind of like a government rule or something like that? Like I thought like this is like secretive society. You're not allowed to do filming or something like that. And they're like, no, it's just we don't want our competition to see what books we've got and stuff like that. And then I explained to them, I said, you know what? Okay, this is why I'm doing it. There's people in the West who say Uyghur children books are banned. I just want to take a short video to show them that that's not the case. I don't live in Kashgar. I'm not going to be sending it to your competition. And they kind of looked at each other. It's like, this guy's weird. Like, foreigners are weird. And it's like, okay, whatever. So I took the video, and then I sent it to the guy I was in contact with. And I can't remember what excuse he came up with. I think he said, yeah, that's very interesting. I wasn't expecting that, but after I consulted some other language experts, they said they're not actually Uyghur folk tales. They're Chinese books that were translated into Uyghur script or something like that. You know, it was,
which doesn't make any sense, because it's a genocide until you explain where's the bodies, and they can't explain that. So then it becomes a cultural genocide. But then you're in a bookstore full of books written in Uyghur script. Yeah. And Uyghur script is on, I think a lot of Westerners don't know this, but it's on the physical money of China. And so what kind of cultural genocide is this, where their language is on every single paper bill in the entire
street
country?
Signs and the menus. When you go to Xinjiang, actually, a lot of the people there don't even speak Mandarin Chinese that well. Even some of the police officers, they struggle in Mandarin Chinese. Like, they communicate in Uyghur. When you hear the kids playing in the streets, they're communicating in Uyghur language. And I got a chance to talk to a lot of people, you know, in the markets and stuff like that. And yeah, I mean, you honestly, like I said, you start feeling like an idiot when you're going there looking for a genocide. You know, it's like, this is stupid. And it really is. There's nothing there to support it. Well, I mean, when you look at the underlying documents that these think tanks and things like that are using to prove that there's a cultural genocide going on, it's really, I mean, they're making these stretches of the imagination. They're inventing new words. They're translating things incorrectly. They're contradicting themselves. They talk about, you know, for example, in their forced labor report, they're saying that, well, we think these people are vulnerable to forced labor because they don't speak Mandarin that well, you know, and they're being sent to these factories. They're finding jobs in factories that are far away, so they're isolated. And then, like, towards the end of the report, they're complaining that China's teaching them Mandarin Chinese. And it's like, well, what do you want? Do you want them to be isolated from the national language? Or do you want, you know, you can see that they're just trying so hard to push this narrative.
They throw as much as possible at the wall, hoping something sticks. And if you read it very carefully, you'll notice a lot of these weasel words where they're like probably, likely, and that's not how you accuse you can't accuse a country of genocide if you're using language like that. If it's likely or probably, then you probably don't have a real case to make. If it's actually happening, just show the evidence. The evidence will speak for itself. They haven't showed any of that. So. So you're going around.
I think it's important to note. I think it's important to note also, constantly we're talking about these theories of what might be happening in Xinjiang and stuff like that. And over the past year, the number of images we've seen of actual Palestinians being evicted from their homes, or dead Palestinian children, and they're saying, we want to go to the International Criminal Court to hear our case, and the U.S. says, no, you shouldn't do that. And when they're asked, well, where should the Palestinians go? They should just sort it out themselves. It's like, they don't actually want to know where the real atrocities are happening. They want to imagine something is happening in China so that they have an excuse to contain them or undermine their progress in the world. I think that's important for people to understand too, because the big question is the why. Why is the U.S. doing this? They're absolutely trying to undermine China's progress. They have a $300 million per year for the next 7-year fund to put out anti-China propaganda against the Belt and Road Initiative, which is making progress and inroads into global South countries that previously only had one single exploitative option, Western option available to them, with what Noam Chomsky likes to call IMF fundamentalism kind of rules that they've got to live under. Now there's finally another choice, and they're choosing China. This is a huge hit to the West, and they want to try to kind of undermine that any way they can.
Which is interesting, because they said, the Belt and Road Initiative will never work, and then as China is doing it, they're saying it looks like it's working, but it's actually a trick. It's a debt trap. And now they have things like Build Back Better World, where they're trying to copy the Belt and Road Initiative. And I thought you just said that it wouldn't work, and even if it did, it was just a cynical trap. And now you're doing it. So. Yeah.
And the other thing they accompany that with too, if you saw, there was a mad rush from European countries to suddenly apologize for their colonial era crimes, like they're an ex-abusive partner begging, saying, please don't leave, give me one more chance. We only did it because we loved you,
Totally crazy. I want to dig into what's going on in Xinjiang now. But before we do that, I just kind of I want you to kind of go into a little more of what you saw there. Maybe talk about that village that you visited, and what do you say to people who say, well, that's just Daniel Dumbrill, he's a mouthpiece for the Chinese government, and they were just taking him around and showing him off? What do you say to people like that?
So the first half of my trip, I didn't let anybody know I was going there. I basically I paid for it myself. Everything was paid for by myself, my flights, my hotels, everything like that. Halfway through the trip, I did reach out to some people because I wanted to go to some coordinates that were supposed concentration camps. And when I reached out to somebody, I got in contact with somebody from the government, and they said, well, you can go there yourself if you want. You can just take a taxi. I said, no, but I want to go inside if it's possible. They were like, we're not sure if we can do that, but I'll check. So they checked, and they said, yeah, sure, just give us the coordinates and we'll take you there. But the only thing is if it's an actual prison or something like that, we can't take you in. I said, yeah, that's understandable. And they took me. I went in. They were empty. They were because if they were what do you call them? The vocational training centers, as they call them, concentration camps, as the outside world calls them. The claim that these programs have all finished and that people have graduated from them seems to be corroborated by the fact that these are empty now. I walked through the buildings. I have some video of it I've been meaning to release. It's on my other laptop that's getting repaired right now. And they've been converted. Some of them have been converted into COVID isolation centers. If people were in high risk areas or coming back from provinces that had COVID cases. And so there was, I saw that. For people, there's going to be people who just say that anyways. Even for the part of my trip where that I was talking to people on my own and going around on my own, even if I show them my Sea Trip receipts that I paid for this myself, they're still going to just say, oh, well, they're always going to find an excuse. These kinds of people that are saying, you're just a mouthpiece for the government, or you're doing this because you have a business in China or something like that. There's nothing I can do, and I'm not interested in changing those people's minds. They're just looking for a superficial reason to not engage with my content or my arguments. If I was only doing it for those superficial reasons, for some sort of incentive or financial incentive, or because I'm just chilling or something like that. It should be incredibly, incredibly easy for people to debunk my arguments and concerns if it was just for that superficial reason. But they don't want to engage with these ideas. When the BBC contacted me, they didn't want to engage in a meaningful way, for example. So I don't really have much to say to them at all. The Kyrgyz village that you're talking about, the video that you liked, I mean, that was really impressive as well. It shows, and what was interesting about that too is, like, you could imagine how a Western media outlet could spin that into a different story. So you had these Kyrgyz families that were living up in the mountains, terrible conditions, dangerous roads. People would die every year from landslides and stuff like that. Very dangerous roads for kids to get to school. So down at the bottom of the mountain, the government builds a new village for them. You know, with the schools, everything is centralized. They give them a greenhouse where they can grow their stuff in it. But then they also tell them, you don't have to come down if you don't want to, but we're providing this for you here. And some people did stay at the top, like you were saying. And it worked out as a good kind of an ecosystem, because the people at the top were still taking care of some of the livestock for the people who went down. And the people who stayed at the top, they still got the land, they still got the apartment, they still got the greenhouse at the bottom, and they could rent it out to somebody else. So the whole kind of a thing that they were doing, you know, there was not too far from there also, I visited a water project that brought in clean water to a 300-kilometer radius. Before that point in time, they were using groundwater that had heavy minerals in it, and it was really not good for health. Like, people were losing their hair and stuff like that. And what they did was they did this water project. It was supposed to be finished in 1 year or 2 years or something like that. And they sped it up, and they finished it in half the time because of how urgent it was. And I was looking at this kind of stuff, and I was thinking, in Canada, we've got Indigenous communities, Native communities that have been begging for decades for clean water. They don't have clean water. Or, you know, schools that don't have asbestos in the walls and stuff like that. They've been begging year after year after year. One of them from the Inuit community got up complaining in front of Parliament, saying she's been waiting her whole life, 30 years for this. She was an NDP member of Parliament. And we still don't have it. We still don't have clean drinking water. Here in China, they just make it happen. But what I was thinking when I was at that Kyrgyz village, I was saying, because the whole time I was there, I was always thinking, how would I spin this into a negative story if I was Western media? And it's very easy. It's very easy to do it. Say, oh, look at this. Now the buildings lack the character, or they were forced to lie and just say they were forced to come down, and all this kind of a stuff. So I mean, it was a really...
Yeah, just show a satellite image. Don't show on the ground what's actually going on there. Just show the satellite image. Look at the wall around it. They're being confined in this complex, which I, you know, when I was looking at that because I checked it out on Google Earth, because I like studying maps, and I looked at it, and I looked at how similar it looks to a lot of the facilities the West claims are you know, concentration camps.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, that's the thing. Go on the ground and take a look, and then look at what the BBC does when they do go on the ground. I don't know if you're familiar with Jason Lightfoot, but he did this video, and then the BBC literally opened up Photoshop and turned the trees all gray. This is what this is the level of deception the BBC is working on, and it's not just the BBC; it's across the board. They're all doing this, and so people need to keep this in mind when. Again, they're the same ones who told us there were WMDs in Iraq. So why anyone would ever believe them ever again? Okay, so that was your trip to Xinjiang. I want to share this right now because this is very relevant. I want to try to do as much on this as possible. This is from The Guardian. This is from 2020, November 2020. U.S. removes shadowy group from terror list blamed by China for attacks. State Department says no credible evidence the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, or ETIM, exists. And down here it says it has been removed from the list because for more than a decade, there has been no credible evidence that the ETIM continues to exist. And then, you know, if you go to this Newsweek article, which was published yesterday, we're recording this on September 11. This is September 10, 2021. Despite China's pressure on Taliban, Uyghur separatists see opportunity in Afghanistan. And what is this about? This is about the head of the East Turkestan Islamic movement, the US State Department says no longer exists, doing an interview with Newsweek. That's what this whole article is. It's an interview with this supposed organization that doesn't exist anymore, doing an interview with Newsweek, US media. And this isn't Chinese state media or Russian state media. Daniel, are you surprised to see this?
I mean, no, I
dig into that a little bit more.
I saw some of this stuff unfolding when they were saying that they removed them from the terrorist list because they haven't existed for a decade. Well, first of all, let's think about that. The Tamil Tigers haven't existed for even longer than that, and they're still on the terrorist list. Why don't, if there is this spring cleaning that they're doing, why haven't they removed them off of the list? They're long gone, right? But the idea that literally one of the generals operating in Afghanistan in 2018 is on record in a video saying they were doing airstrikes on ETIM, and now to say no, they don't exist, it's unbelievable. And then you have all of these apologists coming out saying, whitewashing their existence, saying no, there's no credible evidence that they exist. Almost in conjunction, I think it was around the same time or similar time period when ETIM was being delisted. There was a book by Robert, was it something? It was about the Uyghurs, and it was the same kind of a thing. It was whitewashing the terrorism issue. Alison Killing, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who wrote something on Xinjiang, was saying that there's also no credible evidence that they exist. And when I sent her videos of that general saying in 2018, she just came up with all kinds of excuses and eventually just stopped replying to me. I mean, they exist. They know it. They've basically given them their blessing by removing them off of the terrorist list. The ETIM has a website. I haven't shared it publicly. I know somebody. I interviewed them. They used to be involved in Al Qaeda during their younger years. They've since left and denounced that. But he's still very frustrated with the U.S. But he sends me all this stuff. The ETIM is in their recruitment is in hyperdrive. They're coming out with beautifully scripted videos. Like the cinematography is like Hollywood level stuff. Their WhatsApp number, ETIM, their group's official WhatsApp number is a California number. It's based in the US. I mean, it's completely a whitewashing operation that's going on, and all indications point towards a hope that the US can help foster ETIM, bring them back. It'll be very hard for them to commit any terrorist attacks in Xinjiang, but trying to attack China's Belt and Road points around the world makes sense. Why would they not do that? They're spending $300 million per year in just propaganda, soft propaganda, to try to undermine that. Why wouldn't they dust off their old playbook that they continually use over and over and over again and try to rely on some terrorists to disrupt that as well? I mean, it seems pretty obvious what's going on here.
Yeah, and I just wanted to show people that you're not just making this up. It says right here in the same Newsweek article published yesterday that for many years, the U.S. included ETIM on its terrorist exclusion list, part of Patriot Act measures established after the 9/11 attacks. The Pentagon even targeted the group with airstrikes in Afghanistan up until at least 2018. Now, my math is not very good, Daniel, but that's like 3 years ago. That's a lot more recent than 10 years ago, which is what the State Department said.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they were talking about in dog years or something like that. I'm not sure.
Maybe.
Yeah. No, it's pretty obvious what's going on here.
And then in the same article, they go over, how ETIM was carrying out terrorist attacks in Xinjiang, how all the people they were killing, and how it was real terrorism. So this isn't, when they talk about up until now, up until ETIM's making their reappearance, as if China is doing all of these security measures in Xinjiang for no reason at all. Sometimes they say, well, it's the Belt and Road Initiative passes through Xinjiang, so they want to clear out all of these people, as if, like part of it goes through Pakistan. Pakistan is a Muslim country. They're not clearing out all the people in Pakistan. They're all working together on that. So there's always a big hole in this narrative. And now they're just dusting it off, and they're just throwing this back out there. So China wasn't imagining this. And it just goes to show you, a liar is inconsistent, and the Western media has been extremely inconsistent about this narrative, and it has flip-flopped.
Absolutely. I think with Pakistan being a Muslim country, that reminds me of an important point. Also, is the Western media always talks about the 20 some odd countries that condemned what China's doing in Xinjiang, and in that exact same UN meeting, there were over 50 countries saying that they approved of what China was doing and that they are observing human rights as they're addressing this terrorism issue. And many of those countries were Muslim countries. So many Muslim countries were supporting China. And when you say that to people and you say, look at this, you're ignoring these 50 other countries. And a lot of them are Muslim countries. They're like, oh, well, that's because they're corrupt countries or whatever with financial interests with China. It's like, so you care about Muslims until they say something you don't like, and then all of a sudden they're just a corrupt bunch of people. And you're not looking at the other 20 countries and seeing what kind of economic ties they have with the US to apply your logic equally. And when I started interacting with some of these people, because I put out a video where I talked about my interaction with somebody who graduated from these vocational training centers. And I included a lot of things that I didn't like about China's program. I talked about some of the negatives. And something interesting happened after that. A lot of my Muslim followers from various countries reached out to me and said, you know what, Daniel, they were upset with even my mild criticisms. They said, you're coming from a place of privilege. You're coming from Canada. You don't understand this. You don't understand when Salafist jihadist ideology spread, what it's like. And so when I started having conversations with some of them, the main reasons that they see through the BS is that, one, they understand the level of issue that China's dealing with. They realize that this is a real serious issue. But two, they also see the propaganda being used about forced sterilizations and forced labor camps and all this kind of stuff. And this is basically Al-Qaeda propaganda playbook stuff recycled over again. They've seen it before, like word for word in Iraq, in Egypt. In Egypt, it was that the Christians were sterilizing Muslims. And to this day in universities, Christians can't teach obstetrics because of that, rumor from before that's so implanted in people's minds. So when people look at this, they say, we've seen this before. This is all crap. And there really is a serious issue to deal with here. I think the idea of the war on terror has been so tainted by the US, because when the US does a war on terror, it's not really, it's like maybe killing some terrorists, aligning with other ones. And the ones you are killing are terrorists that you already created to begin with. And, you're going to leave the country in a worse case than you came in. So the idea war on terror has so many negative connotations about it, but there really is a real issue. I mean, if you look even in Kyrgyzstan, in the south of mostly Uzbek ethnic minorities, it's the same thing. They've been radicalized. They want to set up a caliphate. They want to rule their region with Sharia law. This is not too far away from Xinjiang. This is a real issue that exists in these regions. But yeah, I mean, these are the parts of the story that nobody's going to talk about, and it's the context that's left out.
And I think this kind of touches on another thing, and I don't know how you feel about this, but there was this knife attack in New Zealand very recently, like within the last month, maybe the last 2 weeks, and the New Zealand police were following this guy around. I don't know for how long, but 24/7 they had an armed surveillance team following him around everywhere, and he just went into a supermarket, went nuts, started stabbing people, stabbed 6 people. And they shot him dead almost as soon as the attack started. I think it was about within 60 seconds he was dead. And this kind of highlights how the West, as you were saying, when they're not just carpet bombing countries claiming they're fighting terrorism, this is the other way they deal with it, by just watching. They're like a ticking time bomb in society. Yeah. They have no system to reform them, because the prison system in the West is totally broken. They don't have vocational centers to send people off to get reformed.
That's a really, really important point. That's a really important point, that whatever reason, there was a good enough reason that the police thought they needed to follow this guy. They knew that he was, for whatever reason, maybe he was downloading, terrorist material or something like that, but that's not a crime. In that country, or he just didn't cross the line enough. I can tell you what would have happened in Xinjiang while those terrorist attacks were happening, and they were happening all over the place. A lot of Uyghurs were being killed. If the police had enough reason to follow someone like that guy, if he was the same guy in Xinjiang, he would have been placed in the vocational training centers to de-radicalize, skills training, whatever it is to bring him back down. There's people who may still disagree with that. They may still say, well, that's not the right thing to do. You can't, unfortunately, it's unfortunate that this is how the world works. You have to wait for somebody to actually do something rather than go on a hunch or just based on little pieces of evidence. But that's the way that China decided to deal with it. I think it's okay to disagree with that. I think it's okay to say, I don't think that's the right way to do it. But at the end of the day, this is something within, China has certain obligations, UN obligations also, to create safe environments for its citizen, to allow them to walk down the street without having a fear of being stabbed and killed and things like that. They have to do something in the name of human rights as well. I think that's important to know also, is when this Salafist jihadist ideology was coming in, that's when the real cultural genocide was happening in Xinjiang. That's when, women were being forced to wear, niqabs, or, Uyghurs who were caught drinking were, punished or had their ears cut off or something like that. Even though Uyghur winemaking culture goes back even further than the introduction of Islam into Uyghur culture. That's when the real genocide was happening. And if you listen to the West, they would have rather China just step back and let it happen. I mean, you cannot have a valid conversation, according to them, about counterterrorism in China when Vladimir Voronkov from the UN, the chief counterterrorism officer, when he went to China to take a look at things from a counterterrorism perspective, he was totally blasted by everybody, even before he even came out with any sort of a report or any feedback about what he saw in Xinjiang, because it seems like, according to the West, China has absolutely no right to have any sort of counterterrorism measures within their own borders. Kind of Hong Kong too. Am I breaking up, or can you still hear me okay?
I can still hear you. It's like a little hiccup.
Okay,
no
good,
big
good,
deal.
good. Yeah, it's just like Hong Kong also. Like, Hong Kong doesn't have the right to have a national security law like everybody else. It's kind of the same thing all over again.
Yeah, and something else people should kind of take into account is the fact that warfare changes over time. People used to go at each other with spears, and then lines of riflemen, and now tanks and aircraft and drones. And then there's this other aspect of warfare where the U.S. A lot of people say the U.S. and China are competing against each other. I would say they're already in conflict with one another. If you look at Myanmar, for example, the U.S. is backing these arms militants who are burning down Chinese factories. They're burning down Chinese factories. How is that any different than the U.S. just using B-52s and carpet bombing Chinese factories in Myanmar? So in a way, they have found a way to accomplish the same task using a different method. This is kind of a modern way of waging war that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. And then when you're trying to use like civil liberties, like a civil liberty argument when talking about defending yourself against this new form of warfare, it doesn't work. It would be kind of the same as trying to make these same sort of arguments as warfare has evolved over many years. So I'm just kind of wondering, how much do you track like other conflicts, especially like, because that's the thing that I focus on is Southeast Asia and how it's China's periphery, and how all of the destabilization here is directly linked to Hong Kong, and how it's part of this encirclement of China. Do you keep an eye on that, or is maybe a little too much? Because you do go in like very deep depth on the topics that you do cover.
Yeah, I go deep into China. I branch out a little bit sometimes, but honestly, I don't know much about the in Myanmar or Thailand. I really don't know enough to comment on anything of those things. But I think it's probably valuable to look for trends. I did look into Syria a lot, into Libya, because there's a lot of uncomfortable ideas to approach, and I cover that in my video when I was talking about my conversation with a graduate from the vocational training centers, that there are certain things that are done to counteract this, to fight back against this, that just bring me discomfort. And so that's why I'm really trying to wrap my head around the idea of democracy and how societies are run, and that's guiding some of the content that I'm reading now, because Libya is a good example also. I mean, even if you want to believe everything that people were saying about Gaddafi, I mean, that was a country that had social programs in place, free healthcare, free education. They had a land reclamation project, reclaiming land from the desert and giving them to African families to build a farm on. And after he was gone, even if he was a tyrant, even if he was ruling his country with an iron fist, the country descended into chaos. It became a hotbed for terrorism. They were literally trading Africans in open slave markets for $300 a pop, $300 US a head. And it's like, at some point we need to reevaluate about, I don't think at the end of the day there's not going to be one universal system, one universal answer for every society, but it's not going to be pretty targeting some of these new forms of warfare. That's for sure. I just want to add one more thing on when I talk about that guy in New Zealand who would have been apprehended and asked to go through vocational training in China. There's another to really further emphasize that everybody has their own way of doing things. About 3 months ago, there was an ex-police officer in the UK who was caught with material from a banned Nazi group. And because he was caught with that material, he went to prison. There was no reforming. There was no anything like that. So, I mean, that's an even more extreme way of dealing with things. And you could say even more brutal than the Chinese way, because there wasn't even a chance for this guy to be reformed. It was like, no, you're prison. Whereas in China, you would have gone through de-radicalization training. You go home on the weekends. You can apply for leave whenever you want if you've got family matters to deal with. Again, talking about the idea of people being apprehended and placed into these things is an uncomfortable thing. I mean, but at the same time, it's like for these people who have an issue with this, and I have issues with certain aspects of it, come up with a better idea. I mean, and don't tell me to do it the U.S. way, because that involves what you said: carpet bombing people, drone striking weddings, shooting people in the field without any trial, and affecting a number of innocent civilians along the way. Tell us a better idea. What's a better idea, a better way of doing things? But nobody cared. Nobody cared when those terrorist attacks were happening in Xinjiang. Nobody came along and said, wow, you've got a serious issue on your hands, or empathized with the victims like they did with the victims in France when they died, because they're part of the West. They look more like us. So we're gonna do vigils. We're gonna light candles for them. We're gonna have a really deep, meaningful conversation about this. But when people are being slaughtered in Xinjiang, before anybody even knew where Xinjiang was on a map, they didn't give a shit. When I met the imam of Idkar Mosque, his father was slaughtered by the terrorists because he condemned their extremist way of life. He was slaughtered right out back behind his mosque. Nobody gave a shit then. Nobody was lighting a candle for him and saying, wow, how can we deal with this issue? They only care when finally the Chinese government said, we got to do something about this, and we got to do something fast. We're probably going to make some mistakes along the way. There's probably going to be some issues, but that's when everybody took an issue. And not only did they take an issue with it, they turn it into something that it's not. Because I want to make that clear too. I'm not saying that the Western narrative about Xinjiang is correct and China has the right to do that. No, it's not only because they're not reporting on it factually. They're not actually saying, how did China deal with it? They pumped it up to this cultural genocide or physical genocide or whatever it is they're talking about, which is so far from the truth that it creates an environment where it's so hard to bring this conversation back to a place of honesty to discuss it in an honest way.
Exactly. So what they did was they created the security crisis in Xinjiang. The Chinese government reacted to it, and then they used China's reaction to it as an opportunity to crisis on top of crisis. So not only is there a very real security threat in Xinjiang, but now they're accusing China of genocide, and they're attaching all kinds of sanctions and pressure to this. They're pressuring their allies to go along with this. They have very persuasive media convincing large segments of the population that this is happening. And they in turn put pressure on politicians to go along with this. And so it really was a very cynical exercise. And again, like this new form of warfare where you're using people inside a country against that country. And then your control over the media enables you to leverage it, take advantage of it, and exploit it.
And they would have been absolutely, it's a kind of like a damned if you do, damned if you don't thing. If they didn't do anything about it, and these people were, becoming radicalized and then leaving Xinjiang and going and carrying out jihad in various places, right now it's okay because they're carrying out jihad in Syria, and that's convenient to the West. They're destabilizing Syria and they're fighting against Assad. But as I mentioned to you yesterday, if China didn't control this and you had an even greater outflow of jihadist fighters and they started doing some of the stuff that they're doing in Syria in Western countries, affecting Western people, Western families, displacing them like they're displacing the Kurds in Syria, all of a sudden, as I said yesterday, it wouldn't matter if everything was true about what they said about China. The biggest opportunity for the West at that point, for propaganda purposes, would have been to change it into a story of China not doing enough to stop terrorism and being a net exporter of terrorism that's coming for your family. Then all of a sudden people would care about China doing enough to control the terrorists. But they're not. They're killing people in Syria. They're beheading people in Syria. They're establishing a caliphate there. They're displacing Syrian Kurds who are becoming refugees and escaping to other parts of the world now because of these fighters going there. So who cares?
Yeah, and and we were talking about this yesterday, and this kind of pertains to the Western media's flip-flopping. How the BBC back in 2014 used to, they loved to make like this really long multi-paragraph list of all of the terrorist attacks taking place all across China, not just in Xinjiang by these separatists. And again, the whole purpose was to portray China in the worst light possible. They have this crisis and they cannot control it, so they were trying to take advantage of it that way. Then when China controlled it and started solving it, then they attacked completely from another direction. Oh,
damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. So it all comes together at the end. So maybe change gears a little bit. Xinjiang is something that we're probably both going to continue covering. This is not an issue that's going to go away. And as we can see, they're already setting the stage for the next step in this campaign against China. Maybe we can talk about, you live in China, so you've seen over 13 years, you've probably seen development taking place, things like telecommunications, the high-speed rail network. The last time I was in China the only time I was in China was 2007. High-speed rail wasn't operational yet. So you've seen that all come into play, the healthcare system. What else is, what do you think about that? And what do you think, what else should people know about development in China? What else is it that they're doing that's important? And why do you think it's important?
Well, I think, I've just been blown away by the speed that things are done here. When I got here, there was, shortly after I got here, there was one somewhat high-speed train between Shenzhen and Guangzhou. And then, what is it? It's like 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail or somewhere around that now, built in the matter of the time that we're here now. When I arrived in Shenzhen, I think there were 2 subway lines. Since that time, they've built an extra, in this city alone, somewhere like 250 kilometers of subway line. I'm thinking about in Toronto when they started building what was the Shepherd line. I can't remember how long it took. It took like 10 years to build a 7-kilometer line or something like that. I mean, the pace is amazing. In Shenzhen here, all of the taxis, all of the buses are electric now. It was just like, it happened in a span of just a few years. It was just like, boom. Okay, all of the buses are electric now. All of the taxis are electric now. The garbage trucks are electric too. You've got these big, huge dump trucks that are moving to electric. Not all of them are electric yet, but a bunch of them are. You have, you've got so many different things going on. But I think probably what's the most impressive also is not just in the city. It's the poverty alleviation efforts that went on. We're lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, on a scale that we've never seen in human history before. And it really is real. There's a lot of people who try desperately to find ways to criticize that as well. Like the famous coverage that they always do on China is like, no matter what good thing is happening, they always say, but at what cost, you know? So they show, I remember there's this guy, they showed a family who was given a free house, you know, by the government. And when they went in, when the Western journalists went in, they saw that in one of the rooms, they had a picture of Xi hanging on the wall. And they were like, these guys got a free house from the government, but there's a picture of Xi on the wall. And it's
I saw that.
Even the Western audience was like, give me a free house. I'll put it on the front door. What are you talking about? It's like, you know, And is it so weird to imagine that these people are so thankful that they're actually, you know, respecting their leader in this way? I mean, it may seem awkward to Westerners that you're putting the picture of the, you know, leader up in your house. It does seem a little bit cringe, but, you know, no more cringe than when the British were in control of Hong Kong and above every single government building, there was a picture of the Queen, you know, like, I mean, you know, that just is what they do here. The other way people criticize that is talking about how the standard is like $2 a day or something like that for the poverty line. But they got to understand, it's way above just income alone. It's about there's certain needs that need to be met for them too. Housing, healthcare, clothing, education, all of the stuff is provided to these people who were once impoverished. And also they're living on their own land as well. They've got their own land. They've got a self-sustainability. If you were to convert that into how much real dollar value that is, I mean, it's way higher than the standard anywhere else for the calculation for extreme poverty. And you go into these villages and you can see firsthand. And I think that's one of the reasons too, that no matter how many negative videos I showed my family, you know, my Chinese family and stuff like that, they've seen firsthand where they've come from, you know, and where they are now. You know, with you know, when my wife was a kid in the village, they didn't have money for you know, colored pencils or anything like that. They'd go out and they'd find little berries or little flowers and stuff like that to make color from that in order to draw something with. Either they'd make their toy guns from mud and make them into clay like molds or something like that. And they've seen just continual improvements in their lives. So I think that's the most amazing thing. So from a technological point of view in the cities, modernizing, moving to electric, all of this kind of stuff, to the villages, uplifting, you know, impoverished people. It's all, the entire society is moving forward at a rapid pace. And once again, it's really easy to understand why China has such a huge satisfaction rate. And even when I tried to, before, you know, I really started seeing China in a different light, no matter how many anti-China articles, movies, videos, documentaries I pushed on some of my friends here, I you know, they were like, oh, that's interesting. There are definitely some issues there, but they were still really positive about where their country is now and where it's going. You get a sense that people are optimistic for the, you know, for the opportunities that their children will have here. Whereas in the West, when you look at the surveys, people are becoming less and less optimistic that there are going to be opportunities for their children.
So actually, I was going to go into kind of how you might see things in the future, but maybe one more thing about healthcare. You were saying about how the Western media spins everything. They're solving poverty, but at what cost? There was actually an article someone put in the comment section of one of my videos. China's curing cancer too fast, something like that. It's like there's no way someone wrote an article like that, but they did. They wrote an article exactly like that. And I come from a country where there is no universal healthcare. If you tried to pay out of your pocket for healthcare, you will be living under a bridge and probably die soon after. You come from a country, Canada, that people seem to think has like really good universal healthcare. I don't know. I never looked into it. So maybe can you compare healthcare in Canada, where people think it's universal healthcare, and healthcare in China? Like how does that come? That's something that I'm really interested in. I ask everyone who's living in China this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't have too much interaction with the Canadian healthcare system. I think the biggest complaint is just that it's slow, but it's good. You know, it's good healthcare. In China, there's been a push where it's affordability. Like things are very, very cheap here in the hospital. But then there's social programs, social insurance, where a lot of things are covered by the government. And a lot of kind of cancer drugs and all this kind of stuff are really, really heavily subsidized. I mean, the prices here are unbelievably cheap. What's an example? I can't remember. So it was, I think it was, I've got to remember the amount. It would have been like, so my son, he had a fall, and he ended up having a huge bump on his head, and it took a while to go away. And his mood was not good and everything like that. We were getting afraid that like it really affected him or something like that. So we took him for a CT scan when we were in Chongqing. I can't remember the price, but a CT brain scan, it must have been like $10 or $20 US or something like that. I mean, it was really, really cheap, and you get seen right away also. So I don't know enough about the ins and outs of what's included and what's not for the low income families, because I think the people who are brought out of poverty, they have more access to healthcare, or there's more basic services that are free for them. But overall, I don't really have too many complaints about the healthcare system. It works well. It's fairly good quality. That's probably something that's improved a lot over even the last 10 years also. And that's a common story across the board. I mean, corruption, quality of healthcare, all of this stuff, especially in the period of time that I've been here, has improved a lot. I remember when the first year I was here, 2008, 2009, I sprained my ankle, and it was still kind of like the Wild West back then. I couldn't walk, and I called an ambulance. I think it wasn't for the hospital; it was for one of the local clinics. And so the guy pulls up with his ambulance. I get in the ambulance, and we're driving to the clinic as he's smoking a cigarette in the front. I'm like, where am I? But things are way better now. I mean, it just the improvements that have happened have been really remarkable.
Yeah, and I mean that was my experience coming here. I couldn't believe that. Hey, there's these other countries that do it totally different than in the U.S. You think growing up in the U.S. that everything is this is the best possible way a country could do anything, and then when you in the U.S. if you pay for antibiotics out of your pocket, you have to pay the doctor like $80 just to get his signature, and then you have to go to the pharmacy and $20, and then here you just go to a pharmacy. They're trained to know and to explain to you how serious antibiotics are, and then you pay like $1 or $2 for antibiotics. I couldn't believe it. It's just unbelievable. So so these are little things that people should just try to look into. I guess the last thing, and I don't know how long we can go on this, but how do you see all of this going into the future? Maybe development in China, and then also this. I would say conflict already between the U.S. and China. This is something I don't think people understand the gravity of this. The U.S. and the West in general being surpassed by a non-Western nation. How many centuries have gone by where this was unthinkable, and now we're at this juncture where China is in many ways has already surpassed the West. Nations are looking up to China, not the West anymore. People are looking at the West either out of nostalgia, or they're looking out at the West as, oh wait, maybe that isn't the best. Look at what's happening to them now. Maybe this isn't the best system. So how do you see all of that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, domestically, China, they obviously still have a lot of issues that they need to sort out. Affordability of housing in the cities and stuff like that are things that they really need to sort out. So I think they're going to continue looking at ways to improve domestically, but on the international scale, they definitely face a big challenge in terms of. Am I still coming through? Okay, my audio.
Yes,
because you're frozen on your side. Okay, good, yeah. So yeah, I mean, internationally, the attacks against China are obviously going to continue to increase, and this is going to be a massive challenge for them. I think exactly how it's going to play out. Obviously, my worst fears are that it turns into a physical conflict. And I know that people have a hard time imagining that as a possibility. I think we're so far. It's been so long since we've had any sort of a major global conflict that this is something that people probably think isn't even possible. But when from a mathematical point of view, when an empire, or a superpower is taken over by someone else, or is somebody else kind of is on the up and coming, it definitely, there's a high likelihood that it does lead to a conflict. And that's the last thing that America has that's really still powerful. They have the most powerful military in the world, and they obviously have it out for China. I think, you know, it's really hard to know where it's going to go. I think the best thing that China can do is continue to build partnerships with the global South, and focus on building relationships with these countries that have been exploited by the West for so long, and just kind of keep doing what they're doing. They definitely need to up their game in terms of telling their story a little bit better. Their media, their ability to tell their side of the story is absolutely terrible. It's nothing compared to the West. They don't have the same kind of influence that the West has. So it's yeah, I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on that too. Because this is worth exploring a little bit deeper. But it could go in so many different directions, couldn't it?
It could. What I fear is that they're sitting around the table and they're asking themselves, look, if we have a large scale arms conflict with China now, maybe we win, maybe we don't. But in 10 years, we're definitely not going to win. So let's see what we can do to get it going sooner than later. Because when you look at China, you look at what's going on, the fundamentals. Just look at, I always like to look at this number, the STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Yeah. They graduate millions more every single year than the US in this field. This is what drives modern civilization. All technology, from technology that impacts infrastructure and society at home, to the economy at home and abroad, and the military. This is something that China is really improving on, and it's not just like going up, you know, it's exponential. And this is something the US just cannot, they don't have the numbers, and they never will, and there's nothing they can do to balance this equation in their favor. And so this is why I worry that they're going to do drastic, extreme things. I mean, just look at some of the stuff that they're already doing. They're killing Chinese engineers in Pakistan. Those Baluch separatists are openly backed by the US government. They have done resolutions in Congress supporting their aspirations for independence, which is just them condoning their violence, and it's killing Chinese people in Pakistan. They made an attempt on the Chinese ambassador's life in Baluchistan, Pakistan. The conflict in Myanmar, the ongoing protests here in Thailand, they have protests in Malaysia that they're trying to get going, and in Hong Kong. And we were just talking about Xinjiang. So they're talking about killing Chinese people, and they are in the process of killing Chinese people, albeit through proxies. So I'm just worried that they're just going to continue escalating, play it by ear, like see how much they can get away with, and hope China makes this calculation. It's kind of bleak, but to be realistic,
I mean, that's their playbook, right? You know, attacking through proxies. I think that probably is the most likely thing. You know, imagine how much more productive our planet would be if you know, these powers would just work together instead. And you know, while the US is constantly talking about, oh, China's stealing our technology, while they're developing 5G before even the US launches it, you know, when you look at how China engages people on the other hand, is they're like helping other countries with this technology, like they're handing technology over to countries in South America. I think it was either Colombia or Venezuela. They basically handed over satellite tech to them and said, put your own satellite up too. Yeah, we'll help you out. Like, they want to improve the world together. Imagine if they work together on environmental issues and all this stuff. But China inevitably will have to redirect some of its resources towards the military, with the kinds of aggressions they're receiving from the US, and with the writing on the wall that the US wants to confront China. I mean, people always talk about the South China Sea also. Obama agreed not to sail, like they said, China said, they were talking about this, saying that, you know, if you don't sail your ships through the South China Sea and continue to do these freedom of whatever, you know, I can't remember exactly how they worded it. We have no need to go in and militarize some of these islands, to do these kinds of things. And there seemed to be a kind of a soft agreement in place for that. Kishore Mahbubani talks about this in his book also. So I don't have the exact dates or anything like that. But after they continued to do that, China said, okay, all right. And they started putting their foot down and putting some claims onto some of these islands that they said, these are ours, even though we didn't have any interest to militarize them or do anything like that. Inevitably, the more and more you push China, the more and more you attack them, more and more you spend hundreds of millions of dollars to just slander China. I mean, eventually they're going to say, we need to make sure we're protecting ourselves. Mostly it's been in the form of defense, putting, defense missiles along the coast and things like that. But what a loss to our entire world that's where the focus needs to be, is on protecting themselves from this, instead of coming together and using those millions of STEM graduates that you were talking about to actually solve real world problems, environmental issues, and improving people's lives, or having other countries looking at exactly what China did to lift people out of poverty to see how we can replicate that across the rest of the world. We have an excess of food production, and the amount of food we waste could end up feeding all of the people who are in need right now. We've got some issues that probably have some simple problems to it, but we're never going to find them if nothing good could possibly come out of China. And when PBS did a joint documentary with CGTN on poverty alleviation, America was so paranoid and self-conscious that they pulled it from the air because it painted China too positively, while America themselves have a mass poverty issue. Instead of saying, hold on a second, maybe we can learn something from this. And then you have that anti-China guy who I shared the clip with you before, who actually said the government answering the needs of the poor people by making corporations pay into socialism is a bad thing. It's just this.
It's surreal.
Yeah.
That's what they're doing. So there's that. There's as you were saying about China's information game. Protecting information spaces, I think, is in the 21st century, it's as important as protecting your physical borders, your shores, your airspace. The idea that this conflict, it's already a conflict, but the idea that a major armed conflict is inevitable, it doesn't need to be inevitable. If China and its allies and other nations, interested parties around the world, if they really invest in creating a deterrent to this conflict, it could be avoided. So, I always advocate nations like Russia and China that are starting to develop their the defense of their information space. If they could somehow export that to nations like Thailand that have almost zero control over their information space. Twitter and Facebook just run amok here. And just like you were saying, social media can convince people to do almost anything. That's how they get people out onto the streets, is through this, and Thailand's inability to control that and stop that. So if they could hone those skills at home and help, because China exports weapons, why not export the means to protect your information space as well? Platforms that a country could use as an alternative to Twitter and Facebook, and then tell Twitter and Facebook, hey, you can do business here, but you got to follow the local laws. And if you don't, we can replace you because we have this other platform here. So I think things like that, and there's probably a lot of examples across a whole spectrum of areas.
I think that's really important to note also, in terms of the irony also, is that, the West is constantly talking about, China should stop copying and create their own things. And then they create TikTok and all of a sudden they want to ban it because that's something that they don't want to lose control over. It's not, I don't think it was so much that they were afraid China was going to influence Americans through TikTok, which is certainly possible. I think psychological warfare is highly underrated. But I think it was more about the U.S. losing their ability to control these platforms and put out the messaging they want. Like, the Atlantic Council is the NATO-backed organizations that's deciding who gets removed from Facebook and Twitter and all of these platforms. It was them who, after Soleimani was assassinated, they came out with statements, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, saying they were removing people who were too sympathetic towards the Iranian regime, or who was simply pointing out that Soleimani was on his way to a peace mission with Saudi Arabia. They're afraid of losing control. And when you, it's the same way, you know, when they're saying that, oh, don't use Chinese telecommunication systems to their allies, saying that China might spy on you. It's like, you mean they might do what you're already doing to us, like when you tapped Angela Merkel's phone or all of these, you know, European leaders. And when you take that into context and realize how valuable having control over platforms like this is, you start to understand why countries like China have to block them. Unfortunately, I wish they didn't have to. I wish it could be completely open internet, but there's a target painted on their backs. As soon as they do any sort of opening up, it's going to be used as a chance to attack them. And that's what you see with foreign journalists coming in also. When you see foreign journalists coming in and reporting on things, and they're working for these big outlets that are absolutely mouthpieces for their governments. You look at the DW news outlet in Germany, when all of a sudden it was okay to talk about the Palestinians' plight, they came out with a memo that was sent to all of their journalists saying that, here's the rules about covering Palestine and Israel. Do not refer to it as an apartheid. Do not do this. Do not do this. If people are killed on the Israeli side, you say killed. If they were killed on the Palestinian side, you say they died. All of this kind of messaging. So when these mainstream media outlet journalists come into China and they're reporting in Xinjiang and all these places, they're not looking to portray things honestly, or maybe even more importantly, human rights activists. That's even more important. When Western human rights activists come into China, they're not looking for issues to try to help China on and say, listen, yeah, you do have a really big issue here. Let's see how we can work on this together. They're looking for issues to exploit. I mean, as soon as you have any sort of a human rights activist from a country like the US who says, when I grow up, I want to be a human rights activist, and instead of focusing on the human rights atrocities that my country commits on an ongoing basis, even though living in a society that's a so-called democracy where we, the people, are supposed to have power, and I'm supposed to be able to affect the change to stop these human rights abuses from happening, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to spend my time over in this place that people are calling a brutal dictatorship and try to change things in this inflexible dictatorship. Already there, you've got something going on with this dynamic saying, okay, you know what? This is probably going to have a highly concentrated group of people that have something not quite right in the head or ulterior motives going on. So they're under constant attack.
That's a good point. That's a really good point.
And so yeah, you've got all of this stuff going on that China sees through it, and that's why when they're careful about journalists coming in who are actually mouthpieces for empire, who are looking for issues to exploit, and especially human rights activists from outlets that are known to be supportive of regime change and brutal sanctions that cause ordinary people to suffer, you start to understand where if I was the one in charge of a country that had this kind of stuff going on, while I'm doing the right thing by my people, uplifting them, bringing them out of poverty, it would be suicide to just say, okay, come in and do whatever you want, even though you've proven over and over again you're trying to kill us. Even though you've proven over and over again you're trying to completely destroy our country. You're funding rebels and releasing them into Tibet and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, what do you expect them to do? So when you talk about China, and I wanted to mention that because when you said China could export some of their technologies, a lot of people might be like, oh, how could you say that? Because you're talking about exporting censorship and all of this stuff. No, it's exporting the knowledge of, okay, how do you grow your country and protect your security? Because China's obviously done something right in that regard. They've managed to uplift their citizens. They've managed to grow up to the point that they are now. But it really required being careful. If they didn't have these checks and balances in place, there's no way they would have accomplished as much as they have today. I think this is important for people to recognize too.
That is a really good point, and it's kind of goes back to that analogy of looking back at warfare back in the day. You know, when you're fighting a conflict with another country, the army would lay down communication wires. You know, they have the big spool and they're laying down the wire. Would you allow the enemy to just lay down wires all around your own camp? No, you would cut those wires and you'd probably capture the guy laying the wire. And would you let enemy propagandists just walk around your capital spewing their war propaganda to your own citizens? Of course not. You wouldn't allow that. And when you look at the US and their posture towards China, it is adversarial. This is not competition. This is all but open warfare. They're doing everything except open warfare. And so we don't lay communication wires down anymore. We have social media. And this is what China is going around cutting. And this is what other countries need to go around and cut. Yes, a country having full control over their information space, there's obviously the opportunity for abuse there, but that's for the people there in that country to sort out, not some corporation in Silicon Valley that openly works with the US State Department. It's no secret that Facebook and Twitter and Google are always cooperating with the US State Department. The Arab Spring was a perfect example. They were working together years in advance, training activists to send them back to overthrow their respective countries. There's the youth movement. This was an organization set up by the US State Department, Facebook, Google, Twitter. They would all come together and just train these activists during these retreats and then send them back to their country. So yeah, so
the things these platforms do is not consistent. It's completely in line with US foreign policy. If you look at when it was that Facebook was banned in China, it was when those groups are organizing the riots in Xinjiang were organizing in Facebook groups, and the Chinese government reached out to Facebook and said, hey, listen, there's terrible things going on. People are dying in our streets. These terrorist groups are organizing on here. There's riots in our streets. Can you shut these groups down? And Facebook's response was, sorry, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that where we are. And they said, okay, all right, we'll block the whole thing. Now, fast forward, when you had those massive protests, the largest human strike, the largest strike in human history in India, millions of people in the streets, Facebook blocked and censored the Resign Modi hashtag. So they were willing to do it for them. Again, it's depending on, okay, no, we'll help you out here. But in China, as you were saying, riots and terrorism and all this stuff, this is a dream come true for the US because it's been something in the works for ages. And that's why you see such a violent reaction when China finally manages to fix it. They are furious. But yeah, I mean, what could they do? Facebook refused to close down those groups, and they said, okay, all right, that's where we, these kinds of operations have been going on for a long time, but this is where we draw the line. You're out. You can't operate here anymore.
Yeah, and the thing is, the wartime communications, it's not a guy dressed up like a soldier laying down wire anymore. It's Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and Twitter with the little blue bird. It's very disarming, but it's serving the exact same purpose. I'm noticing we're at the 2-hour mark. We could probably talk for another 2 hours. And we just talked for 2 hours yesterday on your channel. I hope that this turns into like a kind of a regular collaboration, because between your insight being there inside China and the way I try to focus on what the US is doing all along China's periphery, this is the big picture. When there's a conflict, people have to zoom out, stop looking at the narratives that the Western media is selling you, and look at the grand chessboard that the US is putting these pieces on, and what they're doing as a wider strategy. There's so much insight that you could provide about these things happening outside of China, and there's a lot that I can learn about, what you know about and what you're studying about inside of China. And I have a lot of respect for someone who sees something that's going on, and you can study it online. That's one thing, but then traveling there to see it for yourself, that is an extra step that not everyone takes. So I want to thank you for taking the time to come on and share your experience and your expertise. And I look forward to coming on in the future and any future collaboration.
Yeah, sounds good. Same with me. I mean, I like the stuff you do as well. More people need to know about this, and it's really remarkable that people on their own haven't woken up to the fact that we have the historical context and examples to show that you should absolutely be questioning these narratives. especially when it looks like it's the same old playbooks that have been dusted off again. But alas, the way narratives are controlled in the West, the way that social media works, like how we were talking about, and the way that just the quality of Western propaganda is just so good that people forget that, hey guys, you know, this is what you should be thinking about, you know, and hopefully both of us together can serve as that reminder. So yeah, definitely looking forward to future collaborations, and appreciate you having me on.
Okay, and I'm going to put the link to your YouTube channel in the video description and in a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Is there any other website or anything else you want people to check out?
No, I mean, I'm a little bit more active on Twitter, which is under my handle, just Daniel Dumbrill. And I keep saying I'm going to start using Twitter less, but I never managed to to get off of it. But yeah, no, just YouTube and Twitter. I'm only on those two platforms, really. I'm not really posting anywhere else.
Okay, so maybe you have to get the Atlantic Council to delete you off of Twitter. Maybe that'll solve the problem. But I'll put that link.
That would improve my quality of life substantially.
It did for me. That and Facebook, it really did. So I will put those links in the video description and then the comment section. And thank you again, Daniel.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.